Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take the vast, overwhelming stack of information you've given us and distill it into the crucial need-to-know insights.
Hello again.
Today, we are plunging into the monumental shadow cast by Joseph Stalin. He's arguably one of the 20th century's most significant and certainly one of his most complex and contested figures.
Oh, absolutely.
The man who guided, or perhaps, a better word is forced, the Soviet Union through these seismic historical events from the mid-1920s right up until his death in 1953.
And this is a deep dive that really demands precision. I mean, we are dealing with massive historical stakes here. Our source material is vast. It covers his unlikely origins, his ruthless consolidation of power.
His leadership during World War II, the Cold War.
Exactly. And of course, the deeply divisive and bloody legacy he left behind. So our core mission today is to move beyond the simple narrative and distill the mechanical, rapid, and intensely brutal transformation the USSR underwent under his absolute dictatorship.
The moment you start researching Stalin, you immediately run into what historians call the paradox of his legacy. It's a real cognitive dissonance.
It is.
On one hand, you have a figure who is still revered by many as the victor of the Great Patriotic War, the economic modernizer who, in the span of, 2 decades, dragged a backward agrarian empire into the industrialized military superpower category.
He achieved what was, by many metrics, an impossible feat.
An impossible feat, but that achievement came at a staggering, almost unimaginable human cost.
And that's the other side of the coin. You have the absolute comprehensive condemnation for the mechanisms he used. The systematic mass repression, the engineered famine, the Holodomor, and the suffering and execution of millions of Soviet citizens.
It's almost impossible to hold both ideas in your head at once.
It is. We have to discuss his rule while keeping those two stark, contradictory realities, the architect of steel and the architect of terror, simultaneously in focus.
It truly is that core tension. Progress through unprecedented cruelty. That really defines his entire era. So let's lay out our roadmap for you, the listener.
Okay.
We're starting with his highly improbable path. From a physically troubled Georgian seminary student and, frankly, a petty criminal, all the way to absolute dictator.
Then we'll pivot to the economic shock therapy of the 5-year plans and the terrifying scale and mechanisms of state violence he unleashed in the 1930s.
Right. And finally, we'll analyze his calculated strategy during the war, how he shaped the post-war world order, and how his very complicated legacy continues to resonate today.
It's quite a journey.
Okay, let's unpack this improbable, deeply troubled beginning. Before he was this terrifying granite-faced figure in the Kremlin, he was Ioseb Jughashvili, a man whose identity was, it seems, constantly being suppressed and reinvented, almost from birth.
That's a key point. Identity was critical. He was born Ioseb Jughashvili in Gori, Georgia in December 1878. What's often overlooked is the profound sense of being an outsider this must have created for him.
An outsider in his own country?
In a way, yes. He was an ethnic Georgian who spoke Georgian as his first language. He actually retained a heavy Georgian accent his entire life, even in the Kremlin. He didn't even learn Russian until he was about 8 or 9 years old. So this background, this sense of regional identity within the vast Russian Empire, it fundamentally shaped his outlook.
And his childhood was just marked by incredible violence and poor health. His father was an abusive, alcoholic shoemaker who frequently beat both him and his mother, Ekaterine.
The adversity started early, and it left permanent physical scars. He was the only one of 3 children to survive infancy. In 1884, he contracted smallpox, leaving these visible facial scars that, later on the vast Soviet propaganda machine spent decades meticulously airbrushing out of official portraits.
Right.
Then, at age 12, he was struck by a phaeton, a kind of horse-drawn carriage. This was a really serious injury that resulted in a lifelong physical disability. His left arm lacked flexibility, it was shorter than his right, and you'll notice it's often concealed in photographs.
That injury actually becomes significant much, much later, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's the reason he was ruled unfit for conscription during the First World War.
It is. It kept him out of the main military disaster that afflicted so many of his future rivals. It's one of those small historical details that just has massive consequences down the line.
Another irony is his education. The Tiflis Theological Seminary.
Right. He was meant to become a Russian Orthodox priest on a scholarship, and he even excelled there at first.
But those religious halls turned out to be a hotbed of political radicalism. He became deeply influenced by pro-revolutionary novels, particularly one called What Is to Be Done, and another, Alexander Kuzbegi's The Patricide.
And it's from that novel, The Patricide, that he adopted his first revolutionary nickname, Koba. Kobe. The protagonist, Koba, is a mountain bandit, a kind of symbol of righteous defiance and outlaw heroism in Georgian folklore. Adopting this name, it signaled his embrace of the underground and, his willingness to use force outside the established moral boundaries.
He was eventually expelled from the seminary, right? For missing exams.
Yes, in 1899, largely due to his clandestine political activities. And from there, he immediately shifted his focus entirely to Karl Marx's philosophy. Joining the Marxist Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, or RSDLP, he went into hiding from the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, as early as 1901. He was fully committed to the revolutionary life.
And that commitment required choosing sides. The RSDLP split.
It did. In 1903, during his initial exile to Siberia, which he promptly escaped in 1904, by the way, the party split into the Bolsheviks, the majority, and the Mensheviks, the minority. Stalin immediately aligned with Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik faction.
And this wasn't just an administrative choice for him.
Not at all. Lenin's faction emphasized a small, centralized, disciplined vanguard party that was totally committed to revolution. That philosophy deeply appealed to Stalin's organizational and, frankly, authoritarian tendencies.
This is where his biography turns into something out of a crime novel. And it's a crucial insight into the kind of power he would wield later on. How did the Bolsheviks fund themselves?
Largely through criminal means, and Stalin was their specialist. We are talking about protection rackets, counterfeiting, and bank robberies. Audacious stuff.
The most notorious was the Tiflis Bank stagecoach robbery.
Yes, in June 1907. And this was no petty theft. It was a massive military-style operation orchestrated by Stalin and his operatives. They ambushed a convoy in Erevansky Square using guns and homemade bombs.
The chaos was immense.
The resulting chaos killed around 40 people, bystanders, guards, police, and injured 50 more. But it raised a huge sum, equivalent to about $4 million in today's money, for the Bolshevik cause.
So what was the reaction within the party?
Well, what's crucial here is that many RSDLP members, even Lenin's Menshevik rivals, officially condemned this kind of armed robbery as politically unacceptable. But Stalin and Lenin privately discussed it and agreed to continue. This fundamentally separated them from the rest of the socialist movement. They were the men willing to embrace unprecedented lethal violence.
Violence as an essential, non-negotiable tool. And the final critical step in this apprenticeship is the name change. He began using the alias K. Stalin around 1912.
The symbolic weight of this is immense. The name is derived from the Russian word for steel, stal. It translates, of course, to man of steel. It's a deliberate projection, a rejection of the physically weak, scarred Georgian boy, Ioseb Jughashvili.
And the adoption of an identity defined by hardness, decisiveness, and unbending ideological rigidity.
That's the persona he would cultivate for the rest of his life.
So by 1916, he's back in the revolutionary circuit, exempt from conscription. When the February Revolution erupts in 1917, overthrowing the Tsar, he returns to Petrograd, St. Petersburg renamed, and immediately steps into a leadership vacuum.
He does. He takes control of the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda alongside Lev Kamenev, and suddenly he's permanently back at the heart of power, ready for the next phase.
Navigating the internal politics of the new revolutionary government.
Stalin's return to Petrograd was strategically timed. His position as an editor of Pravda and a member of the Central Committee gave him the operational footing he needed during the chaos of 1917, while more charismatic figures like Trotsky dominated the public stage.
Right. His role in the October Revolution itself, the Bolshevik coup, is often downplayed, precisely because he wasn't the fiery orator addressing the crowds. He was the administrator, the logistics man.
He was the operator. He served as acting leader of the Bolsheviks during Lenin's period of hiding. He oversaw the 6th Congress and helped direct the coup from the Smolny Institute. While Trotsky orchestrated the military takeover, Stalin ensured the Central Committee was functioning, that communications were open, and that resources were deployed.
A crucial, if unglamorous, role.
Very.
Yeah.
And when the new government was formed, Stalin was right there. He supported Lenin's strategy of immediately establishing the Cheka Security Service and shutting down hostile newspapers. He was appointed People's Commissar for Nationalities.
Which wasn't a major policy portfolio, but it gave him a platform.
A platform to interact with the vast non-Russian regions of the new Soviet state. And we must emphasize his immediate, unreserved acceptance of state violence. He was a champion of the Red Terror.
While others might have had tactical regrets.
Stalin openly argued that state violence was not only effective, but a necessary, even a virtuous tool against internal and external capitalist enemies. He internalized the lesson from the Tiflis robbery. Violence delivers results.
This mindset was really put to the test during the brutal Russian Civil War. He was sent to Tsaritsyn, which was later renamed Stalingrad, to manage food procurement, but he quickly turned it into a military command.
He demonstrated incredible decisiveness, yes, but also a shocking personalized brutality. In Tsaritsyn, he used the local Cheka branch to execute suspected counter-revolutionaries, often without any trial. He purged the food collection agencies of specialists he deemed middle class and had them executed.
He even ordered villages torched.
Yes, to ensure compliance with his grain procurement program. It's a key early pattern. Eliminate the opposition, purge the specialists, and rely on fear.
It also explains how he cultivated a network of loyalists who admired his ruthlessness. People like the future marshals, Clement Voroshilov and Semyon Budyonny.
These relationships were foundational. They were military men who saw Stalin as a leader who got things done, who understood power, unlike the intellectuals surrounding Trotsky. And speaking of Trotsky, this period just intensified their deep personal and political conflict.
Specifically, the Polish-Soviet War of 1920.
Exactly. Stalin disobeyed direct orders during the war to shift his troops to assist Marshal Tukhachevsky's forces at the Battle of Warsaw. This insubordination resulted in a major, humiliating defeat for the Red Army, and Tukhachevsky publicly blamed Stalin for the disaster.
And Stalin never forgot or forgave that.
Never. His antipathy toward Trotsky, who was often Lenin's favorite and Tukhachevsky's defender, became obsessive.
This all sets the stage for the pivotal organizational move, the general secretary position. In 1922, Lenin nominated Stalin for this role, thinking it was just a bureaucratic chore.
Yes, the role was created to manage the growing bureaucracy, the personnel files, the administration of the newly massive party structure. It was seen as purely organizational, too tedious for the intellectual titans like Trotsky or Kamenev.
But Stalin, the organization man, seized it.
He masterfully used the general secretaryship to gain total control over the party apparatus. He oversaw appointments, ensuring that only men loyal to him, men who owed him their jobs, were placed in key positions throughout all the regional party committees. He understood that power lay not in speeches, but in personnel files.
But at the same time, his relationship with the ailing Lenin was completely collapsing.
The sources confirm this. Lenin, disabled by strokes, grew to intensely dislike what he called Stalin's Asiatic manner, his rudeness, his sheer accumulation of power. The tipping point seems to have been Stalin's incredible rudeness toward Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya.
And this all culminated in Lenin's famous testament.
In his final years, Lenin dictated this document, which was scathing in its criticism of Stalin's excessive power and rough manners. Crucially, Lenin explicitly suggested Stalin be removed from the general secretary position.
And while some have questioned its authenticity,
historians overwhelmingly agree it reflects Lenin's final, desperate attempt to check Stalin's ambition. But the testament was suppressed. Lenin died in January 1924, and the power struggle began immediately.
and the secrecy around that document was fundamental to Stalin's ascent, wasn't it?
Immensely. Had the testament been read to the full Congress, the old Bolsheviks, Lenin's original guard, might have successfully organized against him. Instead, Stalin played the role of the humble, grief-stricken successor. He masterminded Lenin's funeral, creating the cult of Leninism, positioning herself as the doctrine's sole, devoted interpreter.
A brilliant political move to co-opt Lenin's moral authority.
It was. And at the 13th Party Congress, when the testament was read, it was only read to the provincial delegates who were already beholden to Stalin's machine. He offered his resignation.
A tactical display of humility.
A brilliant one. It secured his position when it was immediately refused by his rivals. After that, he systematically defeated his opposition. He initially formed a triumvirate with Kamenev and Zinoviev against Trotsky, the left opposition. But once Trotsky was politically marginalized, Stalin turned on his former allies.
And he used a political hammer that would later be used to crush millions. The charge of factionalism.
This is critical to understand. Stalin used the concept of factionalism, essentially organizing against the party line, as a weapon. Kamenev and Zinoviev eventually joined Trotsky to form the United Opposition, but Stalin used the party rules he controlled to accuse them of this crime. By 1927, they were removed from the Central Committee.
And Trotsky was exiled.
First to Kazakhstan and then expelled from the Soviet Union entirely in 1929. By relying on his staunch supporters, Stalin was now the supreme, unchallenged leader.
With the revolutionary veterans defeated, crushed, or exiled, Stalin was free to define the Soviet Union's direction. And he pivoted entirely inward, focusing on transforming the state into a modern industrial power through his signature doctrine, Socialism in one country.
This was the defining ideological shift, a massive rejection of the original globalist Bolshevik view. Stalin argued that Russia could and must achieve socialism domestically first, stabilizing and strengthening the USSR before focusing on global revolution. And this doctrine justified the radical domestic transformation that followed, a transformation fueled by existential fear.
That fear was palpable. The sources quote Stalin saying, "We have fallen behind the advanced countries by 50 to 100 years. We must close that gap in 10 years. Either we do this or we'll be crushed."
That intense urgency drove the first five-year plan, launched in 1928. This marked the birth of the centralized command economy, a total rejection of Lenin's new economic policy, the NEP.
Which had been a kind of tactical retreat towards limited capitalism.
Exactly. Stalin saw the NEP as breeding corruption and capitalist tendencies. The five-year plan was the philosophical and economic opposite. Rapid, state-controlled, heavy industrialization, fueled by the forced extraction of resources and labor from the peasantry.
This is the moment the state violence expands from targeting political opponents to targeting entire classes of people. He turned on the perceived profiteers of the NEP, the affluent peasants, or kulaks.
The term kulak is deceptive. It literally means fist, implying a greedy hoarder. But by 1929, it was applied to any peasant who was resisting state control or refusing to surrender their grain. When Stalin traveled to Novosibirsk in 1928, he claimed kulaks were hoarding grain and ordered immediate confiscation.
This triggered widespread violence.
It did, and it led to the ultimate decision to liquidate the kulak class entirely.
The scale of this dekulakization was horrific.
It was what some historians call the first mass terror. In January 1930, the Politburo approved mass deportations and concentration camps. Kulaks were divided into three categories: counter-revolutionaries to be executed or sent to gulags, active resistors to be deported to remote regions, and those merely resisting to be sent to local camps.
And the numbers.
Over 320,000 households, that's roughly 1.8 million people, were exiled or sent to labor camps by July 1930.
And this terror went hand in hand with mass collectivization. Peasants were forced onto state farms, the kolkhoz and sovkhoz.
They joined out of sheer terror. Collectivization was designed to give the state total control over agricultural output, ensuring cheap grain to feed urban industrial workers and to export for foreign currency. Despite mass resistance, including peasants slaughtering their livestock rather than handing them over, 90% of agricultural households were collectivized by 1936.
And productivity just plummeted.
It did. The system was inefficient, poorly managed, and lacked any incentive. And this disastrous combination leads directly to the tragedy of the famine of 1932-1933, the Holodomor in Ukraine.
Which devastated not just Ukraine, but southern Russia, Kazakhstan, the North Caucasus, killing millions.
The famine was the direct consequence of systemic failure combined with deliberate state policy. The key factors were poor harvests, years of declining productivity from collectivization, and critically, the government's absolute refusal to build reserve grain stocks. Stalin viewed the desperate peasants as political enemies.
So rather than addressing the failure, he blamed the victims.
He blamed the crisis on saboteurs and hostile elements among the peasants. He actively concealed the famine from foreign observers and prioritized industrialization above all else. Grain exports, though diminished, continued.
The scale is hard to comprehend. We're talking about 5 to 7 million people dead.
5 to 7 million, yes. And while historians debate whether this constitutes a deliberate genocide, a purposive killing aimed at eliminating a group, or deaths from criminal neglect on a catastrophic scale, the fact remains that Stalin and the Politburo were fully aware of the crisis and prioritized the industrial state over human sustenance.
And the cost of this rapid industrialization was unimaginable suffering. The sources tell us that massive construction projects, the White Sea-Baltic Canal, the Moscow Metro, were overwhelmingly built using forced labor from the expanding Gulag system.
The Gulag system wasn't a temporary measure. It was an integral part of Stalin's economic machine. It supplied millions of unfree laborers for the most dangerous and critical projects. And within the factories themselves, they introduced the Stakhanovite movement to promote relentless labor intensification.
As this industrial transformation progressed, Stalin declared that class war would intensify as socialism advanced because enemies would become more desperate. This was the ideological justification for the Great Purge of 1936-1938.
The Purge didn't begin suddenly. It started with intimidating show trials, like the Shakhty trial in 1928. But the true ignition point was the murder of Sergei Kirov, the popular Leningrad Party boss, in December 1934. Whether Stalin ordered the murder or simply exploited it, he used Kirov's death as a pretext to unleash the full force of state terror.
And the Purge first targeted the old Bolsheviks, Lenin's original guard.
Precisely. The famous Moscow trials saw the execution of former rivals like Kamenev, Zinoviev, Bukharin, and Rykov. These were elaborate, staged affairs designed to prove to the public that all ideological opposition was actually treasonous collusion with foreign powers.
The destruction then extended beyond the party elite to the military.
The terror against the military was arguably his most damaging move ahead of World War II. In May 1937, Stalin ordered the arrest and execution of much of the army's high command, including Marshal Tukhachevsky. Tens of thousands of officers were arrested. This decapitated the Red Army, removing its most talented and experienced commanders.
Severely weakening the Soviet military just when the threat of Germany was growing. And the repression didn't stop at the elites, did it?
Not at all. It targeted a massive swath of the civilian population. The criteria for arrest were absurdly broad: anti-Soviet elements, former priests, religious figures, or merely those who knew someone who was arrested. The NKVD head, Nikolai Yezhov, implemented specific quotas for arrests and executions across regions.
Quotas for killing people.
Yes, it led to a state-sponsored frenzy. In total, over 1.6 million people were arrested in this period, and 700,000 were officially shot.
We also see the national operations during this time, which was explicitly targeted ethnic cleansing.
Yes, these operations targeted specific groups like Poles, Germans, Latvians, and Koreans, often based on geographical proximity to perceived enemies. Over 1 million people were forcibly deported internally or exiled. The goal was to remove potential fifth columns in case of war.
So what was the motive? I mean, historians still wrestle with it. Was it just ideology, paranoia, or some kind of political necessity?
It seems to be a combination. Stalin certainly believed in the intensifying class struggle, but he also suffered from acute, escalating paranoia. His personal notes reveal these convoluted claims about enemies encircling him. Ultimately, the Purge functioned as a tool to destroy all potential internal rivals and ensure that no one, not the army, not the secret police, not the party, was capable of challenging his absolute power.
How did it finally wind down? Because it seems to just stop.
It ended as suddenly as it began. By 1938, the chaos and systemic disruption were undermining the very state function Stalin was trying to strengthen. The terror ended when the hyper-enthusiastic head of the NKVD, Yezhov, was replaced by Lavrentiy Beria. And once the arrests stopped, Stalin, demonstrating his political genius for self-preservation, blamed the excesses on Yezhov,
Who was then arrested and executed himself.
Exactly. Stalin emerged, once again, clean and above the fray.
As the Great Purge concluded, Europe was already on the brink of war, and Stalin, ever the cynical realist, was determined to keep the USSR neutral, to let the capitalist powers destroy each other.
That political calculation led to the diplomatic maneuver that shocked the world, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939. Seeing Britain and France as unwilling to commit to a real alliance, Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany.
And this wasn't just a promise not to fight.
Not at all. It included a crucial secret protocol that carved up Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. It was a tactical stroke of brilliance, however morally reprehensible. The Soviets immediately moved to invade Poland, occupy the Baltic states, and annex parts of Romania.
But this aggression also included mass atrocities. You're referring to the Katyn massacre in 1940.
Yes, the NKVD executed around 22,000 members of the captured Polish armed forces, police, and intelligentsia. This was a clear, premeditated action to eliminate the Polish elite and forestall any dissent in the occupied territories.
So he's applying the same mechanisms from the Great Purge to foreign policy.
Precisely. Preemptive execution of perceived enemies.
Despite the pact, Stalin chose to ignore repeated warnings from his own intelligence and Western powers. He was completely taken by surprise when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941.
The initial impact was devastating. The Wehrmacht pushed deep into Soviet territory. The Air Force was destroyed in days. Stalin, overwhelmed, reportedly suffered a brief mental collapse. He retreated to his dacha for several days.
But he recovered.
He did. He quickly recovered and took absolute charge as Supreme Commander of the State Defense Committee. And his command style was based on absolute unrelenting terror, directed not only at the Germans but at his own population and troops.
The scorched earth policy.
A scorched earth policy, yes. Destroying anything of use ahead of the German advance, guaranteeing immense suffering for the civilians left behind. He also ordered the NKVD to execute around 100,000 political prisoners ahead of the approaching Wehrmacht to prevent their possible release.
And the treatment of captured soldiers was horrifying. Order number 270.
That order declared captured soldiers to be traitors who risked being treated as such upon their return. It even threatened their families with punishment. His own son, Yakov, was captured, and when the Germans offered a trade, Stalin famously refused, saying he wouldn't trade a marshal for a lieutenant. Yakov died in German custody.
Then in 1942, he doubled down with order number 2207. Not one step back.
That order directed that anyone retreating without specific authorization was to be placed in penal battalions, essentially cannon fodder, or shot by dedicated blocking detachments posted behind the front lines. The order was designed to instill absolute suicidal commitment.
And despite the terror, the immense Soviet mobilization effort eventually turned the tide. The military industry, relocated to the east, managed to outstrip Germany in production.
And the turning point, of course, was the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942-1943. The Soviet victory there marked the decisive strategic shift of the entire conflict. In 1943, Stalin declared himself Marshal of the Soviet Union.
We also see a calculated temporary shift in state culture during the war, a tactical relaxation of rigid Soviet ideology.
Yes, a conscious move to broaden support. He allowed greater tolerance for the Russian Orthodox Church, permitted previously suppressed artists like Shostakovich to publish, and dissolved the Communist International. He was pivoting toward Russian nationalism over international communism to appeal to the broadest base of support.
Globally, he transitioned from pariah to one of the big three, meeting with Churchill and Roosevelt. It's almost surreal that he was referred to in the West as Uncle Joe.
A nickname he apparently found utterly undignified. But despite the alliance, deep mutual suspicion remained. He was a ruthless negotiator. At Yalta in 1945, his prowess secured huge reparations from Germany and territory in Asia in exchange for entering the war against Japan.
And his actions were always driven by the geopolitical need to secure the Soviet state, right? The Warsaw Uprising is a perfect example of this.
A cold-blooded calculation. The Red Army was right outside Warsaw, but paused. The Polish resistance, loyal to the government in exile in London, rose up against the Germans, expecting Red Army assistance.
But Stalin deliberately withheld that aid.
He did. He allowed the Germans to crush the Polish resistance. Why? Because by allowing them to be eliminated, he ensured that there would be no strong anti-Soviet Polish force to interfere with his plan to install a pro-Soviet communist government in post-war Poland. It perfectly exemplifies his ruthless post-war planning.
After Germany's surrender, Stalin adopted the title of Generalissimo. His armies controlled Central and Eastern Europe up to the Elbe River. This was the pinnacle of his power, and he quickly established the Eastern Bloc.
He was incredibly strategic. He initially installed coalition ministries to test the Western reaction, but these were quickly transformed into the people's democracies, all adopting the Soviet model. This is what led Churchill to declare that an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent.
These growing rivalries then rapidly escalated into the Cold War.
They were inevitable. The U.S. launched the Marshall Plan in 1947, which Stalin viewed as an aggressive economic move to undermine Soviet hegemony. So his priorities became securing the nuclear deterrent and testing the West's commitment to Europe.
He got the bomb in 1949, and his test of Western commitment came with the Berlin blockade in 1948.
The blockade was his test. He blocked all access to West Berlin. He was forced to back down only when the West successfully sustained the city through the massive Berlin airlift. This showed him the West would resist politically, but not militarily, a key lesson.
And finally, his strategic reach extended into Asia with the Chinese Communist Revolution and the Korean War.
He was initially cautious about Mao, but once Mao won, Stalin signed a critical Sino-Soviet treaty in 1950. When Kim Il-sung pushed for the invasion of South Korea, Stalin was hesitant. He was absolutely keen to avoid a direct Soviet confrontation with the U.S.
So he used China as a proxy.
He supported Kim's invasion, but then convinced China to enter the war to aid the North Koreans, using them to fight the Americans and their allies, avoiding direct Soviet military involvement.
By the final years of his life, Stalin's health was deteriorating, and as his physical condition worsened, his personal mistrust of everyone around him escalated into dangerous new waves of state repression.
His paranoia was intense. He had survived the war, built an empire, and was now terrified of being betrayed or assassinated. This mistrust fueled campaigns based on manufactured conspiracies, most notably a chilling turn towards state-sponsored anti-Semitism.
This was initially framed as foreign policy, but quickly became domestic terror.
It manifested as massive anti-Jewish campaigns, with attacks on Zionism and rootless cosmopolitanism. This was an ideologically veiled attempt to purge any perceived foreign influence from the cultural sphere.
The most dramatic culmination of this paranoia and the final major purge was the doctor's plot.
In 1952, several Kremlin doctors, predominantly Jewish, were arrested under Stalin's personal orders. They were tortured and forced to confess to plotting to kill senior Soviet politicians. This was a clear attempt to initiate another vast purge. Rumors were rampant that Stalin was preparing the mass deportation of all Soviet Jews to Siberia.
It seems he was preparing for a bloody succession, or maybe just securing his own control until the very end.
He was systematically eliminating any potential rivals. He abolished the Politburo, replacing it with the much larger Presidium to dilute the power of any single person. Then, on March 1st, 1953, he was found semi-conscious on the floor of his dacha. He'd suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. He died 4 days later, on March 5.
The fear surrounding his death was palpable. People were unsure if it would bring relief or chaos.
There was absolute relief among the leadership, but also immense uncontrolled grief among the populace. The funeral procession caused a massive crowd crush in Moscow, resulting in numerous deaths. His body was embalmed and initially displayed alongside Lenin in the mausoleum.
With no designated successor, a collective leadership quickly emerged. Malenkov, Beria, Khrushchev.
And they were united primarily by the desire to prevent any single person from attaining Stalin's autocratic power ever again. The immediate reforms were swift: a mass amnesty, an end to the anti-Semitic purges, and the beginning of the reform of the Gulag system. The machine of terror was immediately dismantled.
But the true ideological break came 3 years later, in 1956, with Nikita Khrushchev's famous secret speech.
Delivered to a closed session of the 20th Party Congress, the speech denounced Stalin's cult of personality, his mass repression, and his violations of Leninist norms. This launched the long process of de-Stalinization. Stalin's body was removed from the mausoleum in 1961, and Stalingrad was renamed Volgograd.
This brings us to the immense and still contested question of Stalin's death toll. For you, the listener, the distinction between pre- and post-1991 data is absolutely vital for understanding this history.
It is. Before the fall of the Soviet Union, Western estimates often exceeded 20 million deaths. However, when the Soviet archives were declassified in the 1990s, historians gained access to official NKVD and Gulag records, providing a much clearer picture of documented deaths.
So what does that current archival consensus look like today?
It focuses on documented state repression. The official records show approximately 799,455 executions between 1921 and 1953. Deaths in the Gulag camps were estimated at 1.5 to 1.7 million, out of an enormous 18 million people who passed through the system. If you add deportees, the total number of officially recorded victims who died due to direct repression or poor conditions is around 3.3 million.
But those figures exclude the victims of the famine, which is where the debate gets truly nuanced and the overall numbers swell again.
Exactly. The 1932-1933 famine adds an additional 3.5 to 6.5 million deaths. The difficulty for historians lies in the categorization. Were these purposive killings, or were they excess deaths resulting from disastrous, criminally negligent policies? The debate is intense, but regardless of classification, these millions of famine deaths must be attributed to Stalin's policies.
So when we hear the larger figures, they're generally combining the documented repression victims with the estimated excess famine deaths.
Correct. The archives clarify the mechanisms and the numbers of direct victims, but they do not absolve Stalin of the excess deaths resulting from his policies, whether those policies were motivated by negligence or malice.
What's truly remarkable is how complex Stalin's image remains today. Yeltsin denounced him, but current Russian leaders have adopted a more selective memory.
Vladimir Putin has consciously emphasized Soviet achievements, the industrialization, the victory in World War II under Stalin's leadership, rather than focusing on the repression. This narrative reflects a continued, and in some areas increasing, popularity in Russia and Georgia, where he is still viewed by many as the decisive, victorious statesman who secured Russia's global power.
We've discussed the staggering scope of Stalin's influence, from transforming a backward empire into a superpower to implementing systematic terror that defined an era.
So what does this vast contradictory history ultimately mean for you, the learner? The way we frame Stalin's deepest motives is critical. We know from our sources that he was a voracious reader, particularly fascinated by history. He admired previous Russian leaders who used immense personal power figures like Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great to drag the state into modernity.
This leads to our final provocative thought for this deep dive. Given his interest in history and state glory, was Stalin's tyranny driven purely by a committed, brutal adherence to Marxist-Leninist ideology, the need to crush class enemies? Or was his rule a form of modern Caesarism?
That is the ultimate historical question. Was it a political system driven by ideology or a personality-driven system? A belief that only immense, absolute personal brutality could ensure the survival and glory of the Russian state, with the ideological veneer merely serving as the ultimate justification for terror.
A question that forces us to ask, if the revolution simply created the perfect vehicle for a man already obsessed with power and state control.
That's a lot to think about.
A question that forces us to look beyond simple labels and consider the full complexity of tyranny in the 20th century. Thank you for guiding us through this essential, if difficult, deep dive into Joseph Stalin.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us. We encourage you to continue your deep dive into this complex and defining historical period. We'll see you next time.